The day I inherited 200 acres of land, a man in an HOA polo shirt told me I was trespassing on it. Behind him were hundreds of houses, neat lawns, shiny roofs, quiet streets, all built on my family's land. They said my inheritance was symbolic. The judge later called it something else, squatting. I stood there for a long second, keys still in my hand, dust settling around my truck, trying to understand how a piece of paper from a lawyer's office had somehow turned into this moment. A gate, a uniform, a stranger telling me I didn't belong on land my family had owned longer than he'd been alive. The security guard wasn't rude. That almost made it worse. He spoke calmly, professionally, like this was a conversation he'd had 100 times before. "Sir, if you don't live in the community, I'm going to have to ask you to turn around." I looked past him, past the gate, past the manicured hedges and matching mailboxes. I saw street signs, playgrounds, porch lights still on from the morning, an entire neighborhood waking up, unaware that the ground under their feet didn't belong to the people who claimed it did. I told him my name. It didn't register. I told him I was there to see land I had just inherited. That's when his expression changed. Not to fear, not to anger, but to something closer to pity. "I'm sorry," he said, "but that land was developed years ago." That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a system, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I didn't grow up thinking about inheritance. In my family, land wasn't something you talked about like money in the bank. It was just there, something steady, something you assumed would still be around even if everything else fell apart. The land had belonged to my grandfather first. He bought it after the war, back when nobody wanted hills full of trees and rock. He worked it with his hands, cleared parts of it slowly, raised kids there, buried a wife there, and left the rest wild on purpose. He used to say land didn't need much from a man, just respect and patience. When my parents died, I was still young, too young to sign anything, too young to understand probate courts, estate limbo, or what happened when paperwork sat in the wrong filing cabinet for too long. The land didn't vanish. It just drifted, held by the state. Managed, they said. Protected, they said. Until I was old enough to claim it, life went on without it. I moved away, built a career, paid rent, bought groceries, lived like everyone else who assumes the past is finished and the future will sort itself out. The land became a story I told occasionally, usually after a beer or two. My family used to own acreage back home. Past tense, safe tense. Then the letter came. It wasn't dramatic, no gold seal, no rush courier, just a plain envelope from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a notice that a long-dormant estate had finally cleared its last administrative hurdle. According to the attached documents, I was now the legal heir to approximately 100 acres of land. I remember reading that number twice, then a third time. 1,200 acres sounded less like property and more like a mistake. I called the number at the bottom of the page. The attorney was polite, efficient, and clearly overworked. He confirmed the details, explained the delay, and then paused, just slightly, before saying something that stuck with me. "There may be occupants." He didn't elaborate. I didn't press. At the time, I assumed he meant maybe a hunting lease or an old caretaker's cabin. Nothing unusual. Land has history. You expect some dust. I didn't rush back right away. I didn't pack boxes or make plans. I told myself I'd take a drive one weekend, see what condition the place was in, maybe walk part of it, reconnect with something that had quietly waited for me for decades. That's how lightly I took it, because no one warns you what it feels like to discover that your inheritance didn't just sit still. It got used. It got built on. It got sold to people who never knew your name. Standing at that gate, listening to a security guard explain community rules like they'd always existed, I finally understood what that lawyer had meant. Occupants wasn't a technical term. It was a warning, and I was about to learn just how many people had been standing on my family's land while I wasn't looking. They didn't keep me waiting long. 2 days after I turned around at the gate, I received an email from the Homeowners Association. Polite subject line, neutral language, the kind of message that pretends this is all very reasonable and very normal. They invited me to a clarifying conversation. The meeting took place in a house I recognized immediately, not because I'd ever been inside it, but because it was impossible to miss. It sat on the highest point in the subdivision, overlooking the streets, the playground, even the small lake they'd dug and named after something that sounded natural but wasn't. Bigger than the rest, newer, better maintained, the kind of place designed to remind everyone who was in charge. That was her house, the HOA president. She greeted me at the door like a politician on election day. Firm handshake, perfect smile, sunglasses pushed up just enough to make eye contact feel intentional. Everything about her said control. We sat at a long kitchen table. Sunlight poured in through oversized windows. From where I sat, I could see rooftops stretching out in every direction. Rows and rows of homes built on land my grandfather once walked without fences. She didn't waste time. She laid out color maps, development plans, and thick binders filled with tabs and highlights. Everything was neat, organized, official. According to her paperwork, the land had been legally transferred decades ago. The subdivision had permits, titles, insurance, the whole thing wrapped up in reassuring language and embossed seals. Then she looked at me and said it. Your inheritance is symbolic. Not harsh, not cruel, just dismissive, like correcting a child who misunderstood how the world works. She explained that while my family may have once owned the land, progress had moved on. The community had invested millions. Families lived here now. Schools, utilities, roads, all built under proper authority. What I had, she said, was a sentimental connection. A story, not a claim. I asked her one simple question. If that's true, I said, why are you talking to me? She smiled again, a little tighter this time. That's when she made the offer. They could buy me out. A generous sum, she assured me, considering the circumstances. Or, if I preferred, I could join the association as a non-resident member. Limited rights, of course, but it would allow everyone to move forward peacefully. She said it like she was doing me a favor. I looked around her kitchen, at the expensive appliances, the view, the elevation. I realized something then that settled deep in my chest. She wasn't afraid of me. She was confident. Confident that whatever papers I held couldn't compete with what she'd already built. Confident that courts wouldn't tear up a neighborhood for the sake of one heir who showed up late. Confident that the system rewarded momentum more than truth. I told her I wasn't interested. The room changed, just slightly. Her smile faded. Her tone cooled. She reminded me, gently, that resisting reality could be costly. Legal fees, delays, complications. She spoke like someone who had seen this play out before and knew exactly how it ended. I stood up. As I walked out, I took one last look through those windows. From that height, the land looked settled, claimed, finished. But I knew better. My grandfather used to say that land remembers who cared for it first. As I drove away, I understood something else. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up with a few documents. This was a power play. And the woman living at the top of my land had no intention of giving it back without a fight. The letters started arriving the following week. At first, there was nothing overtly hostile about them. No threats, no raised voices, just envelopes. White, heavy, official-looking. The kind of mail that makes your stomach tighten before you even open it. The first notice thanked me for my anticipated cooperation. That phrase alone should have warned me. It went on to explain that a review of adjacent properties was underway, and that my inclusion status might soon be clarified. Clarified by whom, it didn't say. A second letter arrived 3 days later. This one included numbers, back dues. According to the HOA's records, I owed nearly 15 years' worth of assessments. Fees for landscaping, road maintenance, security patrols, community amenities I had never used and never agreed to. There was a neat breakdown, a total at the bottom, and a polite reminder that interest continued to accrue. I read it twice, then set it down and laughed. Out loud. A short, humorless sound. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't joined anything. I hadn't even been allowed past the gate. The third letter wasn't polite. It cited violations, non-compliant fencing, unauthorized structures, failure to submit exterior plans for approval. It was impressive, really, how many rules I had broken without ever being a member. At the bottom of the page, in smaller print, was a sentence that changed the tone entirely. Failure to comply may result in enforcement procedures. Enforcement. Not a conversation, not mediation, enforcement. I began to understand what I was dealing with. This wasn't a neighborhood disagreement. This was paper warfare, the kind that doesn't break windows or throw punches. It just buries you slowly, one notice at a time, until you're too tired or too broke to keep standing. I called the number listed on the letter. I was transferred twice before reaching a woman who introduced herself as a compliance coordinator. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, and entirely uninterested in my explanation. "Our records show inclusion," she said. "Inclusion in what?" I asked. "The community," she replied, as if there were no other communities in the world. I asked her to show me a document with my signature on it. She paused, then said, "That will be reviewed during the enforcement process." That was the moment I stopped making phone calls. Instead, I started collecting. Every letter went into a folder, then a binder, then a second binder. I scanned everything. I saved envelopes. I logged dates and times. I printed emails and stapled them together like evidence, because that's what they were becoming. The language in the notices grew colder, more legal, less human. They spoke of aesthetic impact and community integrity, as if those phrases justified reaching across a property line and rewriting ownership by repetition. One letter thanked me for my continued non-response. Another informed me that silence could be interpreted as consent. That one made me sit down. I realized then that this wasn't about convincing me. It was about creating a record. A paper trail that said I had been notified, warned, and given opportunities to comply. A trail that would look very reasonable to someone skimming a file months later. They weren't trying to win an argument. They were trying to outlast me. I drove out to the edge of the land one afternoon and stood there, looking at the trees, the old fence lines, the places my grandfather had marked with stone decades ago. None of that mattered to the letters piling up on my desk. The system didn't care about memory or intent. It cared about documentation, and they had a lot of it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the binders spread out in front of me and understood something else. This was no longer about whether I was right. It was about whether I was prepared. Because the moment an organization starts threatening enforcement on land you own, they're no longer asking permission. They're testing how hard you're willing to push back. And I could feel the pressure building, quiet, steady, relentless, like a hand tightening around a throat, waiting to see if you'd struggle or give in. The paperwork was only the opening move. A week after the third notice, I drove out to the edge of the property again, this time with a printed copy of my survey in the passenger seat. I hadn't planned to confront anyone. I just wanted to walk the line my grandfather had marked decades ago. Old stones, shallow cuts in bark, the kind of boundary that doesn't show up on glossy maps but never truly disappears. That's when I saw the stakes, bright orange, fresh, driven into the ground where they had never been before. I followed them for a few hundred yards and came upon a small group of men in safety vests, GPS units clipped to their belts. They were calm, focused, professional, not sneaking, not hiding, measuring my land like it was already theirs. I asked who had authorized the survey. One of them glanced at a clipboard and said, "The association." I told them they were standing on private property. They didn't argue. One of them simply picked up his phone and made a call. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers rolled up on the access road. The officers stepped out slowly, hands relaxed, expressions bored. I explained the situation. I showed them my documents. I pointed to the markers that had been moved. They listened. They nodded. Then one of them said the words I'd been dreading. "This is a civil matter." I'd heard that phrase before. Everyone has. It's what authority says when it doesn't want to choose a side. As they were turning back to their cars, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The HOA president had arrived. She hadn't come to argue. She hadn't come to shout. She stood near her SUV, sunglasses on, arms crossed, watching the whole thing like a foregone conclusion. One of the officers caught her eye. He lifted a hand. She smiled and waved back, by name. That was it. That was the moment. Not the survey stakes, not the letters, not even the fines. That casual familiarity told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a machine, and it knew exactly how to keep moving without friction. The officers left. The surveyors went back to work. And I stood there, holding paperwork that suddenly felt very small in my hands. I went home and pulled out my grandfather's maps, hand-drawn, yellowed, precise in a way modern prints never are. I laid them next to the HOA's glossy diagrams and saw the problem immediately. Their boundaries crept, just a little. A few feet here, a curve straightened there, nothing dramatic, nothing that would catch the eye unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. But enough to change ownership on paper, enough to claim ground by repetition. I drove the perimeter that afternoon, slow, methodical. I found 3 more markers that hadn't been there before. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the binders, at the letters, at the surveys that didn't agree with each other. I realized that if I kept treating this like a misunderstanding, I was going to lose without ever stepping into a courtroom. So, I stopped playing defense. The next morning, I made 2 calls. The first was to a land attorney who specialized in boundary disputes, someone who had spent years untangling claims older than most buildings. He listened quietly and asked me to send everything. The second was to a forensic land surveyor, not a firm that did subdivisions, but a man who worked with old records, original plats, and historical markers. Someone who understood that land doesn't lie, people do. When I hung up the phone, I felt something shift. I was still outnumbered, still surrounded by homes, roads, and authority that pretended not to see me. But for the first time since that gate closed in front of my truck, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Because once boundaries start moving and police start waving at the people pushing them, you're no longer dealing with a neighborly dispute. You're dealing with a quiet takeover, and quiet takeovers only succeed when the person standing in the way decides to stay quiet too. It didn't turn ugly all at once. At first, it was small things. The kind of things you could explain away if you wanted to believe people were better than they actually are. One morning, I drove down the dirt access road that cut through the trees toward the back of the property and heard a sound that didn't belong there. A sharp pop, then another. The truck shuddered slightly. When I stopped and got out, I found 3 roofing nails half buried in the tire tracks, spaced just far enough apart to do damage without looking deliberate. I picked them up, one by one, and held them in my palm. They were clean, new. Someone had brought them there. A few days later, I found trash dumped near the fence line. Broken pallets, drywall scraps, fast food bags. Not enough to call the county, just enough to send a message. When I cleared it, more appeared a week later, this time closer to the gate. My "no trespassing" sign disappeared overnight. When it came back, it was bent in half, tossed into the brush like an afterthought. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. Each incident lived in the gray space between coincidence and intent, the kind of petty pressure that wears you down because it never quite crosses a line you can point to. Then it started getting personal. My wife noticed a car idling near the end of our drive when she left for work. The same dark sedan showed up twice more that week, never close enough to confront, never far enough to ignore. When she pulled out, it rolled forward. When she stopped, it stopped too. She told me that night, trying to sound casual. I could hear the strain underneath. A few days after that, my son came home from school quieter than usual. At dinner, he asked me why someone at school said we might have to move. When I asked who said that, he shrugged. A teacher heard it from a parent, he said. They said you were in trouble. That was the moment the air in the room changed. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't slam my hand on the table. I just sat there, looking at my family, and felt something harden in my chest. This wasn't about fees anymore. This wasn't about paperwork or surveys or polite threats tucked into legal language. This was intimidation. I added cameras the next day, motion activated, cloud backed, one on the gate, one near the drive, one covering the tree line. I didn't tell anyone outside my house. I didn't post signs. I just watched. It didn't take long. Late one night, the alerts came in, slow movement near the fence, just inside the trees. I pulled up the footage and saw 2 men in HOA branded jackets walking the line with flashlights, stopping to point, to gesture, to talk quietly to each other like they were planning something. They weren't lost. They weren't checking utilities. They were inspecting. I called the sheriff's office the next morning. I explained the nails, the dumping, the car, the cameras. The response was sympathetic but hollow. "Sounds like a civil matter," the deputy said. "Hard to prove intent." I hung up and sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. What struck me wasn't anger. It was clarity. Every step so far had been designed to make me doubt myself, to make me tired, to make me choose the easier path, sell, sign, comply. But the moment my family became part of the pressure, the equation changed. There are things a man can tolerate when they're aimed at him alone. This wasn't one of them. That afternoon, I walked the property again, slower this time. I took photos of old markers, of trees my grandfather had blazed by hand, of stones set where survey stakes now stood. I wasn't wandering anymore. I was documenting. That evening, I sat my family down and told them the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I told them there was a dispute, that it might get uncomfortable, that none of it was their fault. My wife reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Do what you have to do," she said. That was all the permission I needed. The next morning, I made 3 calls, one to the forensic land surveyor, confirming the scope of his work and asking him to dig deeper. Original plats, county archives, anything predating development. One to my attorney, authorizing him to prepare for litigation, not negotiation. And one to a private investigator, someone used to working quietly, following patterns, and finding connections that didn't want to be found. When I hung up the phone, I felt the pressure ease just a fraction. Not because the situation had improved, but because I had stopped pretending it would resolve itself. That night, as I checked the camera feeds one last time before bed, I said the words out loud, just to hear them. This stops now. Because when an organization starts scattering nails on your road, whispering to your kids, and circling your home after dark, you're no longer dealing with bureaucracy. You're dealing with people who believe they can take what they want without consequences. And I was done letting them believe that. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, old pieces, the kind that had been sitting quietly in boxes and drawers, while newer, louder paperwork tried to bury them. The forensic surveyor was the first to call back. He didn't sound excited. He sounded careful, like a man who'd learned that when something doesn't add up, you don't rush to say it out loud. "I need a few more days," he said, "but there's something here." Meanwhile, my attorney began pulling county records, original plats, development filings, anything that predated the subdivision. What came back wasn't clean, not chaotic either. It was thin, like someone had removed just enough to make the story go through without resistance. When the surveyor finally came out to the property, he brought more than equipment. He brought photocopies, old ones, yellowed, slightly crooked, stamped by offices that didn't exist anymore. He walked the land slowly, stopping at trees I recognized, stones my grandfather had set by hand. He didn't talk much. He measured, he compared, he frowned. Then he said the words that changed everything. This land was never sold. I asked him to repeat that. He did. According to the original records, the association had never actually purchased the property. What they had, what the development company had secured decades earlier, was a temporary development lease, a limited right to build under specific conditions, for a specific period of time. That lease had an expiration date. It had come and gone. I sat there, staring at the document, my finger tracing the line where a signature should have been. The space was blank. To renew it, the surveyor explained, they would have needed the consent of the legal heir, me. They never asked. They never could. My attorney leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "That means," he said slowly, "they don't own the land. They never did." The word he used next was the one that stuck. Squatting. Not confused, not mistaken. Squatting. Everything that had followed, the letters, the surveys, the pressure, suddenly made sense. If they acknowledged the lease had expired, the entire structure collapsed. Every home, every permit, every loan tied to ground they no longer had rights to. So, they did what systems do when truth is inconvenient. They buried it. We kept digging. The investigator came back with timelines, names, corporate shells that dissolved and reformed just in time to move liability around. Development entities that existed only long enough to pass paper from one hand to another. And right at the center of it, always just close enough to touch, never quite in the open, was the same name. The HOA president. Back then, she wasn't a president. She was a junior attorney working with the development firm. Her name appeared on internal memos, on early filings, on correspondence that discussed lease continuity in language that danced carefully around expiration dates. One email, dated years after the lease had lapsed, made my attorney go quiet. If we proceed as planned, it read, ownership challenges will be rendered moot by scale. Scale. Enough houses, enough families, enough momentum. No court would tear that down. They hadn't been careless. They'd been patient. I thought back to her house on the hill, the confidence, the way she spoke about progress like it was a shield. I understood now that she hadn't just inherited power in that community. She'd built it, on land she knew wasn't hers. The surveyor gathered his papers and looked at me across the hood of his truck. Land doesn't forget, he said. People try to make it. As he drove away, I stood there longer than I needed to. The woods were quiet. The markers were wrong, but the ground underneath them was the same ground my grandfather had walked. For the first time since this started, the pressure I'd been carrying shifted. Not because the fight was over, but because I finally knew what it was really about. They weren't defending a neighborhood. They were protecting a lie, and lies like that don't fall apart from the outside. They collapse when someone is willing to pull on the right thread. I went home that night and told my attorney to stop preparing for negotiation. We're not asking them to explain, I said. We're proving they never had the right to be here. He nodded once. That was the moment the case stopped being defensive. From then on, everything we did was about exposure, because when an entire community is standing on borrowed ground, the only question left is how long it takes for gravity to do the rest. If the expired lease explained how they stayed on the land, the next discovery explained how they got away with it for so long. Banks don't lend money on faith, not for houses, not at scale. Anyone who has ever signed a mortgage knows that. Before a single dollar changes hands, there's a process. Title search, insurance, verification, layers meant to protect everyone involved. That was the part that bothered me. Because hundreds of homes don't get built on shaky ground unless someone, somewhere, signs off on it. My attorney called it the missing lock in the door. We went looking for it. The breakthrough came from the title insurance side, not the banks themselves, but the companies that guaranteed ownership for them. Every mortgage in that subdivision was backed by a title insurance policy. On paper, that meant one thing. Someone had certified that the land was clean. It wasn't. The investigator dug into archived underwriting files, old correspondence, internal approval chains. What he found made my stomach turn. Not because it was sloppy, but because it was precise. Years earlier, when the original development lease had already expired, a legal opinion had been issued declaring the land free of encumbrance. That opinion had overridden concerns raised by junior underwriters who'd noticed inconsistencies in the chain of title. The author of that opinion was familiar, the HOA president. Back then, she wasn't living on the Hill. She was a young attorney contracted to consult on land use issues. Her name appeared on a document titled Title Clearance Memorandum. It was written in confident language, dense with citations, carefully structured to sound definitive. It was also false. She hadn't proven ownership. She'd reframed absence as authority. Where signatures were missing, she referenced constructive continuity. Where leases had expired, she cited practical reliance. Every gap was filled with legal fog. And it worked. The title insurance company issued coverage. The banks followed. Loans were approved. Foundations were poured. Families signed 30-year notes, believing the system had done its job. In reality, the land had been laundered, not through violence, not through secrecy, through paperwork. My attorney leaned back after reading the report and said something I won't forget. "This isn't negligence," he said. "This is enterprise fraud." That phrase carried weight. It meant intent. Coordination, a plan that assumed if the development grew large enough, no one would dare unwind it. And for a long time, they were right. The title insurance company, when confronted, didn't deny the document existed. They denied knowing it was false. They pointed to reliance on licensed counsel, on certifications, on trust. Trust, it turned out, had been very profitable. When the banks finally entered the conversation, they came with concern and pressure in equal measure. They wanted reassurance, stability, a path forward that didn't involve acknowledging how exposed they were. I listened. Then I showed them the opinion memo. I showed them the lease expiration. I showed them the email that tied the attorney who cleared the title to the same person now running the HOA that claimed ownership. The room went quiet. Because suddenly, this wasn't about one stubborn landowner refusing to cooperate. It was about hundreds of mortgages secured by land that had never legally transferred. One banker asked what I intended to do. I told him the truth. I'm establishing ownership. I said. What happens to your loans after that is up to you. He didn't like that answer, but he understood it. When the meeting ended, I sat alone in my truck for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, not shaking, not angry, just absorbing the scale of what had been done. This wasn't a mistake that spiraled. It was a structure designed to stand as long as no one looked too closely at the foundation. The HOA president hadn't just moved into the best house on my land. She had positioned herself at the center of a system that fed on certainty and punished doubt. Every letter she sent me, every survey stake she placed, every threat of enforcement, it all rested on one assumption: that I would blink first, that I'd sell, that I'd settle, that I'd decide it was easier to let a lie stand than to force the truth into the light. But once I saw how the land had been laundered, how banks, insurers, and homeowners had all been pulled into the same false narrative, I knew something she didn't. Systems like that don't collapse when you shout at them. They collapse when you document them. And we now had the documents. The next step wasn't confrontation, it was exposure. Because when you prove that an entire neighborhood was built on a forged certainty, the question isn't whether the truth will surface. It's who will still be standing when it does. Courtrooms have a smell: old paper, polished wood, burnt coffee from somewhere down the hall. It's not dramatic, it's bureaucratic. And that's what makes moments inside them so dangerous, because when something finally breaks, it breaks quietly. We didn't rush into the hearing. My attorney filed first, clean, precise, a petition to establish title and quiet all competing claims. No speeches, no accusations, just facts that demanded a response. The response came fast. The HOA arrived with a team, 2 lawyers in tailored suits, binders stacked like armor. The president sat behind them, composed, legs crossed, chin high. She wore navy blue and a small gold pin on her lapel. From where I sat, she looked exactly like someone who expected to win. The judge entered without ceremony, older, measured, the kind of man who had seen enough bad arguments to recognize a good one before it finished clearing its throat. Proceedings began. My attorney didn't start with emotion. He started with dates. He walked the court through the original lease, its scope, its limitations, its expiration. He showed the gap where a renewal should have been. He showed the absence of my signature. He showed the quiet handoff from one corporate entity to another. Timed just right to keep the paper moving and the questions away. Then he laid the title insurance opinion on the table, not theatrically, just placed it there, let it sit. The HOA's counsel objected. Hearsay, interpretation, relevance. The judge overruled him without raising his voice. Let's see it, he said. The document was projected onto the screen, dense paragraphs, confident language, legal citations that looked reassuring to anyone not trained to question them. My attorney pointed to the signature block. The HOA president's name. The judge read silently. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. He read the lease again. He compared dates. He flipped back a page, then another. The room grew very still. I could hear someone shifting in their seat. The faint buzz of the projector. My own breathing, slower than I expected. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked directly at the HOA's lead counsel. Counselor, he said, evenly, are you aware that your client's entire subdivision is technically trespassing? The word hung there. Trespassing. Not non-compliant, not disputed. Trespassing. The attorney opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again, pivoting toward arguments about reliance, community harm, economic impact. The judge raised a hand. Answer the question. The attorney glanced back at the HOA president. She was no longer smiling. No, Your Honor, he said. I was not aware. The judge nodded once. That's a problem, he said. He turned back to the documents, to the lease, to the opinion memo, to the timeline that no longer made sense if you read it slowly instead of accepting it whole. The court finds, he continued, that there is a substantial likelihood the plaintiff holds superior title to the land in question. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge went on. Accordingly, all enforcement actions initiated by the Homeowners Association are stayed. Further, the association is enjoined from representing itself as a lawful authority over the property pending final adjudication. He paused, then added something that felt like a hammer. and I am referring the matter of the title insurance certification to the appropriate regulatory and criminal authorities. The HOA president's face changed then. Not anger, not fear, calculation. The hearing adjourned early. Outside the courtroom, the hallway filled with voices, lawyers speaking quickly, phones already out, people realizing this wasn't going away quietly. Reporters appeared as if summoned by instinct. Cameras, questions. I didn't stop. I walked past them, out into the light, and stood there for a moment on the courthouse steps. My attorney joined me, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "That went better than expected," he said. I nodded, but I wasn't celebrating. Because winning a motion isn't the same as winning a war. What the judge had done was crack the foundation. He hadn't torn anything down yet. But he'd confirmed something essential. The story the HOA had told for years, the story banks believed, homeowners relied on, and authorities avoided questioning, no longer held. Back inside, the HOA's lawyers were already pivoting, talking about settlements, about mitigating harm, about finding a path forward. The president didn't join them. She stood alone for a moment near the wall, phone pressed to her ear, voice low. When she noticed me watching, she didn't look away. She stared back. For the first time since this began, there was no confidence in her expression, no assumption that momentum would save her, just the realization that the ground beneath her, literal and otherwise, had shifted. That night, I went home and walked the edge of the property again. The same trees, the same stones, the same quiet. Nothing looked different, but everything was. Because the court hadn't just acknowledged my claim, it had exposed theirs. And once a judge says the word trespassing out loud, you can't put it back in the file. You can only deal with what comes next. For them, that meant scrutiny. For the banks, it meant panic. For the homeowners, it meant uncertainty. And for me, it meant something else entirely. Leverage. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that waits. Because when an entire community learns it's standing on borrowed ground, the real question isn't who owns the land. It's who decides what happens to everyone living on it now. The ruling changed everything, and nothing. On paper, the HOA's authority was frozen. Their letters stopped. The patrols vanished. The gates stayed open. But when you strip away a system that's been pretending to be solid for years, what's left behind isn't peace, it's confusion. I drove through the neighborhood a few evenings later, slowly, windows down. Kids rode bikes in the street, porch lights clicked on as the sun dipped behind the hills. A man waved at me without knowing who I was. A woman walked her dog past a sign that still carried the HOA logo, now looking less like authority and more like a prop from a play that had ended early. These weren't invaders, they were families. People who had signed papers, shaken hands, trusted banks and insurers and inspectors to do the job they'd been told was already done. People who thought they were buying stability and instead inherited uncertainty they didn't ask for. Word spread quickly once the court filings became public. Some homeowners showed up at my gate with folders in their hands, mortgage statements, purchase agreements, letters from banks that suddenly sounded nervous. They weren't angry, not at first. They were scared. One couple sat across from me at the kitchen table and explained how they'd poured their savings into the down payment. Another man told me he'd moved his parents in after his wife passed, believing the community would be quiet and safe. A woman apologized before she even finished introducing herself, saying she'd never supported the HOA board, but had felt powerless to speak up. "We didn't know," she said. "We just believed what we were told." I believed her. Not everyone came with humility. A few arrived defensive, demanding reassurance, asking what I planned to do with their homes. One man raised his voice and accused me of trying to profit off other people's misfortune. I listened. Then I asked him a question. "Did you ever support the letters they sent me?" I said. "The fines, the threats, the pressure?" He didn't answer. That was the dividing line. I didn't lump people together. I didn't punish a community for the sins of a board. But I also didn't pretend there hadn't been choices made along the way. Who spoke up? Who stayed silent? Who helped apply pressure when it suited them? At night, after the house went quiet, I walked the perimeter again. I looked at the lights in the distance, each one marking a family trying to make sense of what had happened to their sense of security. I thought about my grandfather's words, that land asks for respect and patience, nothing more. The court had given me leverage. What I did with it would define everything that followed. I talked with my attorney, with economists, with planners who understood long-term land use better than short-term revenge. The easy path would have been eviction, the legal path allowed it, the emotional path tempted it, but the truth sat somewhere else. If I wanted to end the damage caused by a system built on deception, I couldn't replace it with another one driven by impulse. I needed a solution that held people accountable without destroying lives that hadn't been built in bad faith. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with weight. Because when you're the one holding the deed, the hardest part isn't proving you're right. It's deciding how right you're willing to be. The next step wouldn't be taken in a courtroom. It would be taken across kitchen tables, in quiet conversations, with people who had never expected to meet the actual owner of the ground beneath their feet. And whatever decision I made next would echo longer than any ruling. Because justice, once you reach it, doesn't end the story. It hands you responsibility. And responsibility, I was learning, is heavier than any stack of legal binders I'd carried so far. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. Once the court froze the HOA's authority, everyone started looking to me, not because I wanted them to, but because there was nowhere else to look. The board was silent. Their lawyers stopped returning calls. The structure that had dictated people's lives for years simply vanished. What replaced it wasn't chaos, it was a vacuum. I didn't fill it with speeches, I didn't post declarations online or stand at the gate explaining myself. Instead, I put something in writing, clear, simple, and impossible to misinterpret. A framework. Every homeowner received the same notice. No threats, no legal jargon meant to intimidate, just facts. The land was mine. The HOA no longer had jurisdiction. No one was being evicted without cause. But from that moment forward, occupancy would be governed by lawful agreements, or not at all. I offered long-term ground leases, 25 to 40 years, fixed terms, transparent conditions, no behavioral rules, no aesthetic controls, no committees telling people how tall their grass could grow or what color their doors should be. Just land use. If you paid your lease and respected your neighbors, you stayed. That was it. Some people were relieved. You could see it in their faces when they realized no one was coming to measure their fence or send a warning letter because their trash cans were visible from the street. Others were suspicious. They'd lived under arbitrary authority for so long they didn't trust the absence of it. And then there were a few who didn't qualify. Former board members, the ones who had signed enforcement letters, the ones whose names appeared repeatedly in complaint logs and camera footage, the ones who had helped turn pressure into a weapon. Their applications were denied, not out of anger, out of record. I didn't argue with them. I didn't justify myself. I simply pointed to documented behavior and explained that trust, once broken, isn't owed a second chance by default. The banks came next. They wanted meetings, reassurances, proposals that would let them pretend the last decade hadn't happened. They spoke about exposure, market confidence, and the importance of stability. I listened. Then I told them the truth. You didn't verify ownership, I said. You relied on a forged title because it was insured. That's not my emergency. That's a failure of due diligence. The room went quiet. They didn't like it, but they understood it. With lawful leases in place, something unexpected happened. Appraisals stabilized, then improved. Properties once tangled in uncertainty now sat on clearly defined, legally managed land. No hidden authority, no arbitrary fines, no threat letters tucked into mailboxes. Security returned, not the kind enforced by patrols and penalties, but the kind that comes from clarity. One homeowner told me it was the first time she'd felt like she actually owned her life there, even if she didn't own the soil. That stayed with me. I didn't dismantle a community, I dismantled a lie, and in its place I put something quieter, something boring even, the truth. It didn't make everyone happy, it wasn't supposed to, but it stopped the bleeding. It gave people something solid to stand on, which is more than the HOA ever did. By the time the final court date approached, the outcome felt inevitable. The legal arguments were exhausted. The documents spoke for themselves. The only thing left was accountability. And accountability, unlike authority, doesn't negotiate. It arrives, usually late, but always exact. The end didn't come with applause. It came with paperwork. The final ruling was clear and unambiguous. The HOA was dissolved. its authority voided retroactively. The land, every acre of it, was confirmed as mine, and the fraud that had held the whole structure together was no longer a rumor whispered in hallways. It was a finding. Assets were seized. The HOA president's house on the hill went first, then the accounts, then the consulting firm she'd used to funnel fees and favors under a dozen different names. What she'd spent years collecting, quietly, confidently, was taken back the same way, quietly, on paper. The court ordered restitution. Funds recovered from the seizure were set aside for homeowners who had been misled, people who had bought in good faith and paid for certainty they were never given. It didn't make them whole, nothing ever does. But it acknowledged the truth. She lost everything the same way she'd tried to take mine, without asking, without permission. With the HOA gone and lawful leases in place, something else happened, something I hadn't planned for, but welcomed. Property values rose, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Appraisers returned. Banks resumed lending. Buyers stopped asking about risk and started asking about terms. For the first time, the land was being managed honestly. No committees, no fines, no letters slipped under doors, just clear agreements and predictable rules. Families stopped worrying about whether a misplaced mailbox would cost them a month's mortgage. They planted trees, painted porches, lived. One evening, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me near the old gate. He'd lived there for years, kept his head down, paid his dues. "Funny thing," he said, "my place is worth more now than it ever was under the HOA." I nodded. "When ownership is clear," I told him, "value tends to follow." The signs came down next. The old HOA logos, bold, official, meaningless, were removed one by one. In their place, I had a single sign installed near the entrance. Nothing flashy, no threats, private land, no HOA. People took pictures of it, some smiled, a few shook their heads, life moved on. I still walk the property. I still stop at the stones my grandfather set and the trees he marked by hand. The neighborhood looks different now, more lived in, less managed, less afraid. I don't pretend everyone sees me as a hero. Some never will, some lost more than they gained. That's the truth, and it matters. But justice doesn't mean nobody gets hurt. It means the right people stop getting away with it. When the dust finally settled, I stood where the hill used to overlook a system built on intimidation and certainty, borrowed from lies. The ground felt the same beneath my boots. Solid, patient. Land doesn't ask much, just respect. And when you give it that, when you refuse to let it be used as leverage by people who mistake control for ownership, it has a way of setting things right, slowly, firmly, without asking permission. That's what happened here. Not a victory lap, a correction. And for the first time since that gate closed in front of my truck, I wasn't standing on borrowed ground. I was standing where my family always had, on what was rightfully ours.